Hey everybody, this is Alex O'Connor. Alex is a very persuasive atheist speaker. His arguments are extremely persuasive. He's a philosophy major. He's debated people in a lot of settings. So I was wondering if I would be able to refute Alex's best arguments for atheism. Now, this is a bit of an older video from Alex, but in this video he lists off what he cites as his most persuasive arguments for atheism, at least based on his mindset at that time. So let's see if I can refute these arguments. Now, before we get into the meat of Alex's arguments, just a reminder, we are a very new channel, so your support really does mean a lot to me. If you click the like button on this video, that's really wonderful. If you would subscribe to the channel, I would really love that. If you click the bell icon, that'll make sure that you don't miss out on any future videos. And the most important thing for me is to add your voice to the comment section, because that's where I get to interact with you more. I respond to each and every comment individually and personally, and honestly, a lot of your comments have been really educational for me, so I really appreciate the comment section. And as just one final preface before I get the video going and before we go through Alex's arguments, just so you know, these are like sort of condensed, edited versions, so I will put a link to Alex's original video so you can see his full arguments in context, but I didn't want to make this video too long, so I did shorten his arguments considerably, but I only did that to really respond to the salient points. But if you want to make sure you're not missing anything, check out Alex's channel, which is also really wonderful, so you should definitely check out, like, and subscribe to that channel as well. Alright, so here comes Alex and his best arguments for atheism.
I have, to put it mildly, been looking for God. I went to Catholic schools, I studied philosophy and theology at A-levels. I made a career out of engaging with religious arguments. I have explored arguments from contingency, from fine-tuning, from motion, from mathematics, from irreducible complexity and the alleged resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. It may surprise my followers online to learn that at university I visited numerous churches on the invitation of various friends. I spent hours talking with religious friends until the sun rose again, if you like. I attended Bible groups regularly too, which might surprise people as well, and in fact I still do attend such groups. Just recently I agreed to embark on a series of study of the wisdom literature, specifically reading it again in the hopes that this time I might finally feel a divine presence seeping from between the lines. I moved into a house for a year with two devoutly Christian housemates, with the express intention of seeing if the obvious truth of Christianity and theism that people like to talk about can be found in the minutiae of daily life. I have looked, in other words, in a great deal of places. Nothing, not once, not nearly, not ever, not even briefly have I experienced anything that speaks to the existence of a God in the universe.
Alright, so this is an interesting argument. This is the argument of non-resistant non-belief. So this is not Alex's original argument, although he does put a lot of narrative of his own experience into this argument. This argument was originally formulated by J.L. Schellenberg, and his hypothesis is that a truly benevolent God would not allow non-resistant non-belief to exist. Alright, so let's unpack what Alex is saying, because I did shorten this quite a bit, and I just want to give some representation of the fact that Alex does go on for quite a while, talking about all his experiences with religion and the numerous ways that he gave religion a chance. Now, with that in mind, let's look at some of the counter-arguments against what Alex has said. So the first real problem with this argument, and why it doesn't, I'm kind of surprised that he started with it, and it does seem less persuasive to me, is because the whole linchpin of this argument is Alex's own mindset, which is hard to prove or disprove, right? I can't actually make the argument that Alex is thinking what he claims to be thinking in this video. Moreover, I think it sort of establishes a weak basis for evidence. In other words, we might just as well show a video of somebody who's very certain that God exists and he says, yes, I know that God exists, therefore God exists, and you should take my word for it. I feel like this is a weak argument for Alex to make, because the linchpin is his own mindset. Or reason number two why I kind of wasn't crazy about this argument. The evidence that Alex gives for non-resistant non-belief is very poor in this example. So he is speaking as someone who engages somewhat voraciously in religious pursuits. So, he devotes a lot of time to studying religion. He interacts with a lot of people who are religious. This speaks to at least a vested interest or some sort of a pre-existing belief system. Now, it suggests that he's at least not coming into the discussion as a blank slate. Now, let's use like an analogy for this. I'm pretty agnostic about mustard. I don't care for mustard, but I was just trying to come up with something that I have very little preference about. So I've actually never purchased mustard, but I've never gone to a restaurant and said, please don't put mustard on this sandwich. So almost always, if mustard comes on a sandwich, I'm fine with it. If there's no mustard, I'm fine with it. If there's some other condiments, I'll probably use other condiments, but maybe I'll use mustard if there's some mustard available. If somebody really recommends a bottle of mustard to me, I'll try the mustard. But anyways, I am totally non-resistant, in my opinion, about mustard. If I suddenly decided that I was going to become a connoisseur of mustard, and I tried every mustard, I talked to mustard enthusiasts, I wrote articles for a mustard journal, and I still had a negative opinion about mustard, then you would quite reasonably guess that I had some sort of a pre-existing belief about mustard, or at least a pre-existing bias. All right, a lot of other arguments here. Argument number 3. Wouldn't God have to somehow be evident to eliminate non-resistant non-belief? Now, this is a recurring theme because what Alex lists off as his arguments are requirements which do, at first glance, seem like they're very reasonable. But if you think about what God would need to do to satisfy the criteria that Alex is laying out, you realize God would have to be very, very interventionistic in order to eliminate non-resistant non-belief. And then, of course, you have a whole other set of problems with a God who makes himself obvious and apparent. That sort of eliminates your chance to make up your own mind about God. All right, the fourth reason that I wanted to dispute this is not really a reason, but another recurring theme that you'll see in this video is Christianity does seem to be in a uniquely good position to deal with the issue of non-resistant non-belief. There are a couple of reasons, but the one that comes first to mind is the parable of the worker in the vineyard. So one of the morals of this story is that if you come in late, even if it's at the 11th hour, you still receive the same, coin, the same denarius as those who served for longer and worked throughout the day. Now, at first glance, when I first read the story, I said, wow, this seems really unfair. But when I thought about it some more, I realized that, this is an interesting way in which Christianity seems to show particular sympathy to a wide spectrum of non-believers. So again, this is a recurring theme that Alex's arguments do set up Christianity in a position where it is uniquely able to dodge some of his arguments. All right, reason number 5 why I would reject Alex's thesis is, in some ways, the Socratic method of Jesus is, a nice embrace of non-resistant non-belief. I feel like, a lot of religions are like, this is God, you have to believe in this God, and that's just the way it is. I feel like Jesus does not approach us with the same way. He approaches us knowing that each of us occupies sort of a different state of evolution in our belief system. So, Jesus talks to each of us slightly differently. In the Bible, to some of us, Jesus says that he's God. To others of us, he asks us, who do you say that I am? To others among us who are entrenched in negation already, he stays completely silent. You can kind of think the relationship that Jesus had with the Pharisees. So, in some ways, Christianity does seem to leave room for a journey in a lifetime of evolution of our beliefs, and that seems to me poetically resonant with the methods of teaching of Jesus. One final point that I like to make with this is, Jesus isn't the kind of God, he's not the kind of teacher who spells everything out for us in really clear ways. He asks 340 questions in the Bible, so he's very Socratic in his method, and he answers only about 10 questions in the New Testament, depending on who you ask. But everyone agrees that he actually only directly answers a very small number of questions. All right, reason number 6. This is a bit of a hard argument to make, but I don't actually personally believe that Alex is a non-resistant non-believer. And this is only because I've heard him speak a lot, and he always comes across as very confident. And I would even say, and this is not meant to be a dig on Alex, but I would even say that he sort of lacks humility and he's inclined to believe in his own pre-existing worldview. Again, not meant to be a dig or an insult, but, and by the way, I don't know Alex at all personally. We don't know each other at all. So this is just based on the way he presents in his YouTube channel. But I would argue that his persona does argue against him being a non-resistant non-believer. All right. Reason number 7 why I reject this thesis is it possible, consider for a moment, if it's possible even, for Alex to make this argument having only lived a fairly small percentage of his life? Because to me, this argument presupposes that you're at the end of a lifetime of non-resistant non-belief. So, I think that's a reason to sort of take this argument with at least a grain of salt. Reason number 8, doesn't there have to be at least some state of non-resistant non-belief to decide that you embrace God? In other words, there ought to be some spectrum of intermediate states between belief and non-belief before you decide that you embrace God. They're just those states have to exist for you to move through that idea space and engage in a journey of belief. All right, and the final argument I'm going to make is going to be very brief, but there are a lot of arguments for divine hiddenness in general. This is again rooted in not only the lessons of Jesus, but in the way that Jesus teaches. So I would say that Jesus' teachings are much more aligned with a God who is somewhat divinely hidden. Now, I wouldn't necessarily believe in divine hiddenness the way that we talk about it, because to me, like, mathematics and astrophysics aren't really hiding from humanity, but at the same time, they're slowly revealed. And I feel like God's nature is maybe the same way, that you have to sort of intellectually grow, you have to intellectually understand them, you have to spiritually grow before you can reach a state where you say, yeah, I believe in God. All right, now there's a bunch of other arguments against non-resistant non-belief. There's the epistemic distance argument, which means that, to know God, you through a process of free will, you have to at least be able to choose a more neutral starting point. I think it's a reasonable argument. There's another argument, the relational experience with God is more important than what you know about God. So it's really not what we know about God, it's how much we can learn about God that's more important in our lifetimes. I think that's a persuasive argument. There's the argument for timing. So maybe God is timing our revelation of God's nature in order to maximize the spiritual fruits. So in other words, maybe God is waiting for the right time in our lives to reveal divinity to us, so that we have sort of the most spiritual fruit from that journey. There are other defenses, like the soul-making defense. In other words, God may be allowing non-belief to exist so that we can cultivate our own spiritual maturity, our moral responsibility, and engage in a freely chosen relationship. There's an argument from epistemic humility, right? Saying we are not really in a position to judge what information God should be revealing to us or not revealing to us. And there's another argument, finally, which is kind of a more eschatological argument. In other words, in our lifetimes and after our lifetimes, perhaps, we may have several iterative chances to come to believe in God. So this is also, in a way, that Christianity seems to be well suited to address this argument. One of the themes of the New Testament, in my mind, is that there are a lot of times that humans will be given iteratively a lot of chances to know God. So I think that's an interesting idea. That also makes the argument that that there might be a state of more neutral belief system in our lives. All right, so I know that was a lot of arguments that I ran through really quickly, but I think there are a lot of arguments to be made against Alex O'Connor's argument specifically for non-resistant non-belief. But let's hear his next argument now.
But it does get worse yet. You'll remember that my second fact that I said that I would bring up is the geographical predictability of religious belief. Not only does theism need to account for non-resistant non-belief, but also for the fact that such belief is unequally present across the globe. Stephen Mason has pointed out that the populace of Saudi Arabia is 95% Muslim and therefore 95% theistic, whereas the populace of Thailand is 95% Buddhist and therefore, at best, 5% theistic. How likely you are to be a theist, in other words, is intimately tied to the place in which you happen to be born. Now consider naturalism or atheism. Religion varying by region is exactly what we would expect if it is a man-made cultural phenomenon, and nothing like what we should expect if there is, in fact, one true God who loves all equally. Again, I think atheism provides a much stronger account of this fact of our world.
All right, so as many of you know, I was an atheist for a long time, and as an atheist, I found this argument to be very persuasive. But let's take a step back and look at it. And unfortunately, the counter-arguments that I'm going to make for this one are a little bit more complicated, so they take a little bit more effort to explain. And hopefully I can get through all of them eloquently and persuasively while still making the same points that I'm intending to make. So my first counter-argument is, again, if we engage in a thought experiment and say, let's say that we are God, how would we sort of sidestep this issue? In other words, what is a way that a theology could exist in the world and be geographically homogeneous in order to sidestep the criterion that Alex is laying out here? And there's essentially no way to do it. Like, let's say every person would have to be born with innate knowledge of the New Testament. That's almost impossible to do, right? Our brains develop over time. We learn and incorporate information differentially depending on our stage of intellectual development and mental development. So there's almost no way that you could have a completely geographically homogeneous distribution of any religion. So that's my first counterpoint. My second counterpoint is to just add the point, because I was not aware of this for a long time, but to add the point that, again, Christianity seems uniquely poised to deal with this consideration. And the reason why is because Christianity is, according to Pew Research, and I'll put some links on the screen or in the discussion section, but Christianity is the most geographically and demographically and ethnically diverse religion on earth out of all the major religions. So Christianity most closely resembles the type of distribution that we would expect to see if we had an idea that was started out in one place, was embraced by a lot of people, and then developed and propagated slowly around the world. So again, I think Christianity is uniquely well positioned to sidestep this issue, even relative to other religions. Argument number 3 is sort of what I like to call the analogy to electricity. So I think if you're making the argument that Alex is making, that everyone should have equal exposure to Christianity, it's easier to make that argument at the end of human history. We're somewhere at the midpoint of human history. And so I don't think you can make the argument that an inhomogeneous geographic distribution of theological knowledge is a disproof of the existence of God. And let's talk about the analogy with electricity. So electricity started off in a specific location on Earth, and then it was gradually spread throughout the world, and it still has not penetrated every corner of the globe, obviously, right? There are civilizations that don't have access to electricity. There are civilizations that use electricity minimally. So this doesn't disprove electricity, right? Electricity is still a good and interesting idea. It's a good way to do work. So, but it's not an idea that it has universal and complete geographically homogeneous penetration. So the fact that something isn't uniformly geographically accepted does not disprove that it's either a good idea or truthful. And the fourth point is Alex is sort of in this argument committing what's called a genetic fallacy, which deals with the origination of an argument. So in other words, let's say Alex is essentially saying here, well, if you're Christian, you're only Christian because you were brought up to believe in that religion. Now, that's an interesting observation. You can definitely say that you have a propensity to believe something that you were brought up with exposure to. But on the other hand, that doesn't disprove the merits of that idea in and of themselves. And the next argument I want to make is argument number 5, which is the argument of epistemic humility. I think there is a degree to which Alex is, in making this argument and establishing a criterion, putting himself in a position where he says, this is the information that I expect God to provide for me. That's not what I would call epistemically humble. In other words, it's sort of like expropriating the role in the universe where you know what information should or shouldn't be provided. All right, the next argument is I don't know that I could certainly say that theism would predict a different distribution of religions around the world. So in other words, Alex's argument is predicated on the idea that the distribution of religions that we see around the world is uniquely predicted by atheism. I don't think you can make that argument. In other words, I think a theological model of the universe would have a similar prediction of religions and religious ideas being geographically heterogeneous. All right, now the last argument that I want to make is a little bit complicated, and I can sum up this argument by saying that I think that it's likely true that in biblical and extra-biblical sources about Christianity, that God is probably grading us on a curve. So in other words, you have statements like Luke 12, verses 47 through 48, where he says that, from everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. So this suggests that there are some people who aren't as aware of certain information, and may have a different set of expectations. And there are people who do have maybe more spiritual gifts, or they're in a more spiritually privileged position, or they're more exposed to certain theologies, and those people will be sort of judged by different criteria. This is also supported in the book of Romans, where we deal with how Gentiles have to accept the laws of the Old Testament. And essentially Christianity is predicated upon setting up a different set of rules for the Gentiles. Now, this speaks to the fact that there are certain people from other cultures who will not have the same exposure to value systems, beliefs, and practices, and therefore will not have the same expectations. There's also statements like 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7, which states that God looks at the heart. There's the analogy of the sheep and the goats from Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46. This suggests, by the way, this book of Matthew, this particular verse from Matthew is particularly insightful because it makes the point that there are people who feed the hungry, who clothe the naked, who visit the sick, and those people are essentially serving Christ without realizing that they're serving Christ, and they still get credit for those actions. Jesus says, whatever you do for the least of among you is what you do for me. So essentially, Jesus is impressing upon us that it's important for us to be altruistic, for us to be supportive of each other, to support each other, particularly in times of adversity. And when we do that, we sort of get credit for that. So again, I think God is essentially, grading us on a curve. I don't believe that somebody who's not exposed to the New Testament as it's written necessarily goes to hell. And I think Alex's argument presupposes that judgment is going to be uniform across all geographic and ethnic and cultural inhomogeneities. And I don't think that's the case, and I don't think you can support that with just a very neutral, scholarly read of the Bible. Okay, hopefully those arguments all make sense, and hopefully they all articulate the very basic point to this, which is that I don't know that geographic inhomogeneity is in and of itself an argument against theology in general or theism in general or any specific theology. All right, let's hear Alex's next argument. And by the way, I'm jumping in here even after I already had said a bunch of stuff, and I'm jumping in to just add on that after digesting these arguments for a few days, I think that Alex makes a really good point here, which is that whatever religion we have and whatever beliefs we have, we ought to think carefully about what in our background led us to those beliefs. And I think it's a really good point that we should be skeptical about our beliefs because they will vary depending on what we've been exposed to, what our upbringing has been, what our cultural milieus have been. So I do think that's an important point, and I wanted to add that on to my earlier commentary on Alex's argument. Thanks. All right, back to the video.
Finally, then, the third fact of our universe, which is gratuitous suffering. Gratuitous here means something like unjustified or unwarranted or meaningless. I do this because it's easy to see how some instances of suffering may be beneficial in certain circumstances or necessary to bring about some desirable state of affairs, some desirable end. But what could possibly be served? What possible end could be served? What possible meaning could there be in stubbing your toe or tripping over a curb or having a pigeon use your new suit as a restroom? Such instances are not significant. They're usually forgotten within a day or two, and therefore do not and cannot develop the soul. Nor do they seem plausibly part of some grand design or plan. They seem, that is to say, meaningless and unnecessary. More meaninglessness than instances of, let's say, great or intense suffering, much more meaningless than these. And truly meaningless, unnecessary suffering is certainly more expected in a world without benevolent supervision than in a theistic paradigm. A successful theodicy, in other words, then, needs to provide not only an account of the great and intense sufferings of the world, but also the menial sufferings which pervade the human experience.
All right, so this is an interesting take on a fairly old argument of the problem of pain. So I'm going to bring up some of my usual responses that I bring to the analysis of pain, and then I will sort of tailor those a little bit to the problem that Alex brings up, which is why is there trivial pain? All right, so the first problem is, again, we could try to envision a scenario where God would act to mitigate this contention that Alex makes, but that becomes hard to do without making divine intervention onto the universe completely obvious for all people. Now, it's important to recognize that pain exists on a relative scale. So There's no absolute scale of pain. It's all how we experience it, and we experience it through lenses that are inherently emotionally and psychologically filtered. Let me give you a thought experiment that explains that in greater detail. So let's say I have the opportunity to petition God. Let's say I happen to be friends with God and we happen to have lunch every few weeks, and I can, ask God to do things to intervene in human civilization in ways that I see fit. So you can imagine a situation where I have lunch with God and I say, well, here's the lowest 2% of the human population in terms of the bell curve of human suffering, and here's how much that lowest 2% is suffering. Can't we do something to fix things for that lowest 2%? Well, let's say God is sympathetic and says, sure, that's fine. So you could imagine a situation where that happens, but then the next week, when I meet with God again, there's going to be a different lowest 2%. And because human suffering is relative, they will essentially be shifted down to where their suffering seems all the more horrific because of that. So then I again petition God and I say, hey, can't you get rid of the suffering for this lowest 2%? Now, you can imagine this thought experiment extending ad infinitum until the border of human experiences becomes so narrow, so banal, and so meaningless that life has essentially no meaning. And, this is a problem. So, in other words, it's hard to imagine God getting rid of any specific percentage of the pain that we feel. So I think this thought experiment makes the point that if you extend that analysis ad infinitum, then you have a situation where God would even get rid of the most minor pains. And in that type of situation, if we stub our toe, it would be an excruciating amount of pain. It would be like setting our whole bodies on fire because, again, of the relativity of pain. All right, argument number 2. Would any of us really choose an existence that's free of pain but is less authentic? Let's say I had the opportunity to hit a button that would mitigate my experiences of minor inconveniences and minor painful episodes. Would I really hit that button? I think that the answer is no. AI has become more pervasive in our lives. With our increased exposure to AI, there are a lot of thought experiments around artificial intelligence that become sort of interesting to consider. One of the problems with artificial intelligence is that if you give it an instruction like saying, please optimize, human happiness, then, AI could take that instruction and say, okay, I'm going to therefore remove any authenticity from your experiences and put you all in a chamber where I'm constantly stimulating the pleasure centers of your brain, and that's your entire existence. Now, strangely, if you think about it, if the AI decided to stop doing that, we would experience that cessation as excruciatingly painful. But the point of this thought experiment, and it's also, I think, relevant to animal experiences as well, the point of this thought experiment is that I think we would generally choose authenticity over a less authentic and more pain-free life. So if that's the case, and that's what we would suggest for AI, why should we hold it against God for doing essentially the same thing? All right, argument number 3. I think that the existence of larger, more severe episodes of pain presupposes that there ought to be sort of a spectrum in pain from the very small to the very large. So what Alex is saying here is, why don't you just get rid of the very small amounts of pain? It's very hard for me to imagine because, I think if you just take away that very small amount of pain, then it's hard to imagine that you would be able to process the larger amounts of pain in a way that is the same way as what would mirror what we see in the human experience. So I don't know that you can get rid of just a specific part of the pain-pleasure spectrum like that. Argument number 4 is, I do think that perhaps God already has intervened in our darkest moments, and the reason for that is because I got very interested in near-death experiences. They're very interesting to study because they often occur in some of our most painful moments. If you've ever had the experience close to drowning, it is a horrific and frightful moment. And yet people who have had those experiences, who have near-death experiences, who kind of reach the point where they're almost, I don't want to use theologically charged terms, but almost crossing over, people who have had those experiences speak of them with a lot of warmth and a lot of benignity, and almost always cite the presence of some entity that was very welcoming. It's either a light or a presence or a sense of overwhelming calmness. Now, there is no evolutionary or biological reason why we should feel that. In other words, death should be just as horrific as possible to us. So it makes me wonder if perhaps God already has intervened to sort of mitigate some of the pain of being human. Now, you may say, well, doesn't this contradict the other arguments that you've made? And I don't think it does. And the reason why is because it's not definitive proof, it's indirect proof. So, in other words, I sort of, as I've said in other videos, I sort of believe in a God of breadcrumbs, a God who lays out evidence, who leads us along. I think if you look at the universe, the evidence for God is also very much breadcrumby. And if you look in the New Testament, the evidence for Jesus is also very much like breadcrumbs. So I think these are interesting parallels that are somewhat poetic when you consider them together. But my point here is to say that near-death experiences suggest that in our darkest and most painful moments, God does actually intervene to mitigate our pain. And I think near-death experience evidence does point us towards the direction of God. All right, argument number 5. I do think that the weight of our morality when we make decisions that affect the world is determined by the way other entities around us suffer or the way their quality of life is improved. So the problem with Alex's argument is it sort of deprives us of moral implications of our actions. In other words, I think the fact that other people can suffer because of the decisions I make adds a moral dimensionality to my decision making that would not exist if suffering were non-existent, even if you took away only part of that spectrum of suffering. Argument number 6. Pain is obviously an important survival mechanism, including very much the trivial episodes of pain. There's an entity actually called congenital insensitivity to pain. Every now and again that shows up in superhero movies like Kick-Ass, where people are insensitive to pain, or they somehow lose their sensitivity to pain, they essentially become a superhero. That's actually not the way it works in real life. People who have congenital insensitivity to pain lead very horrific lives. They often will have amputations of their digits or even amputations of their hands or feet. They have terrible degeneration of their, joints because they don't realize when they're, creating, episodic little micro traumatic injuries to their joints. So it's definitely not a superpower. It's definitely something that decreases your quality of life. But the point is that pain is important to biological systems. It's important throughout biology that we pursue stimuli that are pleasurable and we avoid stimuli that are noxious, even in very basic biological systems. So it's very hard to imagine a universe where there would be some part of the spectrum of pain versus pleasure that we just wouldn't experience. All right. Argument number 8. I don't know that a world without pain would be something that I would be interested in. It would probably be very shallow and very meaningless. And the other question is, would we even be motivated to pursue anything? Would we be motivated to have positive experiences if we didn't have the negative experiences? Argument number 9, there is a cumulative effect of micro-suffering. So I think if you just get rid of that spectrum of experiences and you leave the big episodes of pain, you kind of miss out on all of the little things that you engage in throughout the day that build character, that build your own patience. So I think you can't really get rid of micro-suffering without stunting human, psychological, emotional, and spiritual development. And the last argument is it's hard to really imagine micro-joys without micro-suffering. Now, of course, all the other arguments that I'm glossing over are still important, but I feel like you all are already familiar with those arguments like epistemic distance. I talked a little bit about epistemic humility. Other people talk often about the problem of free will. Free will sort of presupposes that we exist in a world where there's pain and pleasure. So that's 10 arguments against this contention that if there is a God, then minor pain should not exist. But what do you think about those arguments? And what do you think about Alex's arguments in general? Again, I would encourage you to watch Alex's full video. Alex is a really great YouTuber. I find him to be a very interesting person to watch, and I really like a lot of his videos. Not all of his content is atheistic. He also has many other very interesting things to say about the universe. So I would encourage you to check out his channel. Even just as a lay person from the public, I found it to be a really huge honor to be able to engage in Alex's arguments in this manner. And that's because of you all. So if you've made it this far in the video, then I'm super, super grateful that you supported our channel in that way. Don't forget, if you like this video, if you click the like button as a new channel, that really does help us out tremendously. If you subscribe to the channel, that means so much to us as a new channel. We are only 99,950 likes away from getting that silver play button. So, yeah, so please subscribe. Please click the bell icon for notifications so you don't miss out on any future videos. And the thing that's most important to me is just engage with us in the comment section. I'd love to know what you think about these videos or what you think about my ideas in general. Does this move the needle for any of you? Those are questions that I'd love to have the answers to. So thanks so much for tuning in. Thanks so much for supporting the channel. And as always, please have a really wonderful day.